Do you believe your home is truly a safe place to shelter a Labubu? After the stories we've told here, you may never think the same way again. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and come face truths you'd rather ignore forever. But be very careful. Some doors, once opened, never close again, and what enters our lives through them can change our existence in ways our rational mind simply refuses to accept. Today we're going to talk about a doll completely different from any other we've featured on this channel. A seemingly cute, innocent, and collectible creation, it carries a dark and terrifying reputation that haunts collectors across the civilized world. Many firmly believe that it conceals within itself an ancient curse that has crossed geographic borders and entire oceans, leaving a bloody trail of absolute despair, uncontrollable madness, and indescribable terror in its wake, like a supernatural plague that silently spreads among those who dare possess it. This is the macabre and disturbing story of the dreaded golden Labubu doll, and what you're about to hear may forever change your perception of seemingly harmless objects that decorate our homes and our lives. Elena Vasquez was an extraordinarily beautiful 23-year-old woman who carried on her delicate and fragile shoulders an emotional burden far greater and heavier than her youth could suggest or bear. After the sudden, unexpected, and utterly tragic death of her beloved father in a horrific car accident on a country road covered in thick snow and treacherous ice during a winter storm, her life was irreversibly and devastatingly changed forever. She was forced by cruel circumstances to leave behind the small, isolated mountain village in the most remote regions of Romania, where she grew up surrounded by dense, shadowy forests that whispered ancient legends during moonless nights, and ancestral tales of terrible curses that echoed through the dark, icy corridors of her centuries-old family home, to desperately seek a new beginning in the majestic and imperial Vienna, capital of Austria. In the cosmopolitan Austrian city, she landed a job at a truly centuries-old and historic toy store, a magical establishment that seemed to have stepped straight out of the pages of a dark, Gothic fairy tale, with its antique, hand-carved oak shelves filled with porcelain dolls with glass eyes that seemed to follow visitors, teddy bears worn by time and the care of past generations, and ornate music boxes with bronze details that played melancholic and mesmerizing melodies by composers forgotten by time, creating an almost otherworldly and enchanted atmosphere that made customers feel transported to another time and dimension. On a particularly cold and gray morning in a harsh winter, when snow covered Vienna's historic streets like a silent, immaculate white blanket that muffled all sounds in the city, transforming it into a dreamscape, the old toy store received a completely mysterious and inexplicable package that left all the employees, from the newest to the most seasoned, deeply intrigued, apprehensive, and slightly disturbed. The boxes consisted of several heavy, solidly constructed boxes, hermetically sealed with blood-red wax and decorated with strange and arcane symbols deeply engraved in the dark wood, sent by a completely unknown and mysterious foreign manufacturer who specialized exclusively in producing extremely limited collections of rare, exclusive, and supposedly unique dolls. The sender had no legible return address, only geographic coordinates that, when later verified, pointed to a mountainous, uninhabited region in the heart of Romanian Transylvania. As she carefully and methodically opened the mysterious packages with her own trembling hands, Elena felt her breath catch in her throat for an eternal moment of pure surprise and fascination. They were the world-famous Labubu dolls, known across the planet for their unique, peculiar, and unmistakably captivating appearance, and desperately sought after by fanatical and obsessive collectors in virtually every inhabited part of the civilized and barbaric world. The vast majority of Labubu dolls had the same charming, standardized, and commercially appealing design, with their vibrant, cheerful colors that appealed to the childlike aesthetic sense of any observer. But one of them, strategically positioned in the exact center of the main box as if it were a precious jewel on display, immediately captured Elena's complete attention in an almost magnetic, irresistible, and supernaturally compelling way, as if the doll were literally calling her name in inaudible whispers that only her soul could hear and understand. Unlike absolutely every other doll in the extensive collection, which displayed standardized, commercial, and completely ordinary colors found in any toy store in the world, this particular one possessed a completely hypnotic, otherworldly golden hue impossible to adequately describe in human words, as if the very essence of sunlight had materialized and condensed on its surface in a magical and disturbing way. The golden color was not simply a paint or pigment applied during manufacture, but seemed to emanate from within the doll's very structure, pulsing gently like a golden heart beating with a life of its own, radiating a warm aura that contrasted sharply with the frigid temperature of the Viennese winter. Her blue eyes were as deep as the Atlantic Ocean during a nighttime storm, seemingly observing, analyzing, and cataloging every movement, every breath, and every thought of anyone who dared to meet her piercing, disturbing gaze directly, while her wide, permanent, and eternally fixed smile conveyed a pure, childlike innocence that, for some completely inexplicable and viscerally disturbing reason, caused a deep primal and instinctive discomfort in any sensitive soul who gazed at it for more than a few consecutive seconds. As soon as the first morning customers, mostly seasoned collectors and dedicated parents searching for the perfect gift, noticed the unexpected arrival of the coveted Labubu dolls in the store, they were literally snatched from the shelves in a matter of a few frantic minutes, as if a collective, uncontrollable, and contagious fever had suddenly taken hold of the entire store. Normally polite and civilized customers shoved each other roughly, discussed prices, and fought for positions in line like wild animals vying for territory, creating an atmosphere of chaos and desperation Elena had never witnessed in all her months working in that normally peaceful and orderly environment. The collective behavior was so strange and out of character that even the elderly store owner, a traditionally calm and unflappable Austrian man who had witnessed decades of fads and consumer crazes, was visibly disturbed and confused by the hysterical reaction of his regular customers. But before the last doll disappeared forever from the shelves under the avalanche of desperate hands, Elena, completely fascinated, mesmerized, and magnetically attracted to the unique and apparently special golden version, secretly separated it and hid it for herself, carefully storing it in her personal bag while her heart beat rapidly with an inexplicable mixture of excitement, anxiety, and a dark foreboding that she chose to completely ignore in that moment of irrational euphoria. Elena took her precious new acquisition home with the same pure, genuine, childlike joy of a small child receiving the most desired and dreamed of gift on their special birthday, feeling an immediate and inexplicable emotional connection with this inanimate creature that seemed to pulse with a life of its own in her careful hands. As soon as she crossed the threshold of her modest but cozy apartment located on the third floor of a historic and charming 19th-century building, she delicately and ceremoniously placed the golden Labubu on the solid wood table in the living room, strategically positioning it under the soft, yellowish light of the vintage lamp inherited from her Romanian grandmother, so she could observe and admire every microscopic detail of her new companion with a growing, almost obsessive fascination. The doll seemed even more beautiful and mysterious under that intimate and warm lighting, her blue eyes sparkling like precious frogs and her golden smile seeming to grow more expressive and almost alive as Elena watched her with devoted attention. She then decided, following a natural and innocent impulse, to formally introduce her new inanimate companion to her faithful, loyal, and inseparable four-legged friend, a German shepherd dog with a fur as black as night called Nero, who always showed a natural, friendly, and playful curiosity for absolutely all the dolls that she used to regularly bring home during her years as a dedicated collector. But this particular time, unlike all the previous occasions when Nero had reacted with joyful curiosity and a wagging tail, the animal reacted in a completely aggressive, territorial, and genuinely terrifying manner that left Elena utterly shocked and confused. His normally loving and loyal eyes instantly glazed over with primal fear and animal panic. He bared all his razor-sharp teeth in a display of aggression Elena had never witnessed in all their years of harmonious coexistence. He growled deeply like a wild wolf defending its territory against deadly predators, and barked desperately and continuously with an intensity that sent the neighbors banging on their walls, as if facing a deadly, invisible, and supernatural threat that only his heightened senses could detect and comprehend. Nero's behavior was so extreme and out of the ordinary that Elena initially thought her beloved animal might be sick or suffering from some kind of sudden neurological disorder. But when she looked directly into his eyes, she saw only pure terror and a sharp intelligence that clearly identified a real and present threat in the environment. Nero's shiny black fur stood on end, forming a frightening, primitive ridge along his spine, transforming him into a wild, menacing creature that Elena barely recognized as her docile companion. His normally calm, yellowish eyes couldn't stray from the golden doll for a second, staring at it with a laser-like intensity that seemed to pierce the inanimate creature's soul. The Labubu, in turn, seemed even more alive, conscious, and disturbingly real under the dim, yellowish light of the antique lamp, as if it were feeding on the room's electrical energy and gaining life force with each passing moment in its new home. Elena tried desperately and repeatedly to calm her faithful and normally obedient companion, speaking in the soft, loving, maternal tone that always worked perfectly in stressful situations, offering her favorite treats and trying to divert her attention with toys. But the terrified and traumatized animal slowly but resolutely retreated to the living room door, refusing with unwavering determination to set a single paw again, as if the floor itself had turned to incandescent lava or corrosive acid that could instantly dissolve her flesh. Nero's extreme reaction was so intense and genuine that Elena began to feel the first threads of doubt and apprehension weaving through her mind, but her fascination with the golden doll overpowered any instinct for self-preservation or animal warning. Thinking it was just a momentary and temporary oddity that would surely resolve itself with time and patience, Elena gently and carefully placed the golden Labubu on its special shelf dedicated exclusively to her most precious and meaningful pieces, meticulously arranging it among her other collectibles accumulated over years of passionate dedication. She went to sleep in her comfortable bed with a satisfied smile on her face, dreaming of the endless possibilities her new acquisition could bring to her growing collection. However, as she lay between the soft, familiar Egyptian cotton sheets, she noticed through the half-open bedroom door that Nero remained wide awake, alert and vigilant like a military sentry on guard duty, his intense and worried gaze fixed on the dark hallway that led directly to the living room where the golden doll silently awaited its first night in its new permanent home. During the first silent and seemingly innocent hours of the morning, when the city of Vienna slept soundly under its blanket of snow and only the icy wind whispered between the historic buildings, Elena was suddenly awakened from her deep sleep by a completely strange, unusual, and genuinely disturbing sound that echoed mysteriously throughout her house like an eerie symphony. Small, delicate, rhythmic footsteps, as if someone extremely light, possibly a small child or a person of diminutive stature, was walking slowly and deliberately through the ancient wooden corridors, exploring every nook and cranny with methodical curiosity. At first, her still sleepy brain tried to rationalize the phenomenon, thinking it might simply be Nero exploring the house at night as he occasionally did when he was nervous or restless. But as she carefully craned her neck to peer through the crack in the door, she saw with growing surprise that her dog still remained in the exact same strategic position by the living room door, completely still as a bronze statue, tense and attentive like a soldier on watch, with his pointed ears pricked up, picking up every suspicious sound and his eyes fixed intensely in the exact direction from which the mysterious sounds originated. The sound of the ghostly footsteps continued for long, agonizing minutes that seemed to stretch on for eternity, following a rhythmic, deliberate, and almost musical pattern, as if someone or something were methodically and systematically exploring every hidden corner of the house, gradually familiarizing itself with the territory and memorizing every detail of the architecture and furniture arrangement for future reference. The footsteps were not random or haphazard, but followed a specific, intelligent route that suggested prior knowledge of the house's layout or a supernatural ability for spatial navigation that transcended normal physical limitations. Elena felt a cold, primal shiver run down her spine like a low-voltage electric current as she remained completely paralyzed by growing fear, listening intently to every single sound that broke the sepulchral silence of the Viennese dawn, her breathing becoming increasingly shallow and controlled, so as not to miss any auditory detail of the supernatural experience she was witnessing. When she finally gathered enough courage and determination to investigate the phenomenon herself, she silently rose from her bed, placed her bare feet on the cold wooden floor, and tiptoed into the living room, only to find absolutely everything exactly as she had left it before falling asleep, with the golden Labubu occupying its designated position on the bookshelf, smiling eternally with that innocent expression that now seemed slightly more sinister under the dancing shadows of the early morning. In the days that followed that first disturbing night, strange, inexplicable, and progressively more intense phenomena began to manifest themselves gradually but absolutely constantly, transforming Elena's previously peaceful and organized life into a growing and seemingly inescapable nightmare that tested the limits of her sanity and emotional stability. Personal objects began to systematically appear out of place without any logical, scientific, or rational explanation that could satisfy her Cartesian mind. Keys that she religiously always left in the same position on the kitchen table mysteriously appeared on the refrigerator or inside drawers she was absolutely certain she had never opened. Books that had remained alphabetically organized for years on her shelves were found mysteriously open to specific pages containing detailed information about ancestral rituals, transgenerational curses, and methods of communicating with supernatural entities. And her other collectible dolls, some of which she had owned for over a decade, seemed to have been carefully and deliberately repositioned during the nighttime hours, all now facing in a uniform direction toward the golden Labubu, like soldiers paying military obeisance to a supreme and all-powerful queen or devout believers worshipping a sinister and implacable deity. The apartment's ambient temperature began to fluctuate dramatically, without any apparent meteorological or technical reason that could be identified by professional inspections, creating geographically defined zones of intense, unearthly cold that moved through the house like invisible yet palpable presences, following specific routes that seemed to correspond precisely to the paths taken by ghostly footsteps in the wee hours. These zones of cold were not merely temperature changes, but seemed to carry a dense, oppressive emotional quality that made Elena feel observed, judged, and gradually consumed by a profound melancholy whenever she crossed them. Simultaneously, the electric lighting throughout the apartment began to flicker intermittently and seemingly intelligently, especially when Elena approached the sacred bookshelf where the golden doll remained eternally motionless, observing everything with its piercing blue eyes that seemed to follow every movement with morbid and calculating interest, like a predator patiently studying the habits of its prey before the final, definitive attack. Elena gradually began to notice profound, disturbing, and increasingly alarming changes in her own mental, emotional, and physical behavior that left her genuinely worried and confused, questioning her own sanity and psychological stability for the first time in her adult life. Her nightly dreams dramatically transformed from peaceful and restorative experiences into vivid, terrifying, and cinematically detailed adventures, replete with recurring images of a lonely, melancholic child endlessly playing in a pastoral field shrouded in dense, otherworldly fog, always inseparably and obsessively accompanied by the same golden doll that now permanently inhabited her domestic bookshelf. These dreams were not merely passive experiences, but felt like real interactions, where Elena could feel the texture of the damp grass beneath her bare feet, the sweet, unsettling smell of the fog that carried the scent of flowers that had died decades ago, and most importantly, the constant, oppressive presence of the doll watching her with that eternal smile that gradually became more sinister and menacing with each successive night of shared dreams. During her daytime work hours at the toy store, Elena began to feel constantly watched, analyzed, and judged, even when she was absolutely certain she was completely alone in the establishment, as if invisible but intensely real eyes followed her every professional move with morbid interest, cataloging her actions and reactions for later analysis by a superior and malevolent intelligence. This feeling of constant surveillance wasn't merely paranoia or social anxiety, but a tangible physical perception that made the hairs on her arms stand on end and her skin crawl whenever she moved between the toy shelves, especially when she passed near the dolls that began to seem strangely familiar and hostile. Her professional concentration and ability to focus began to fail drastically, turning simple tasks that she had performed automatically for months into monumental challenges that required conscious and deliberate effort, and her coworkers, people who had known her long enough to recognize changes in her behavior, noticed with growing concern that she frequently stared blankly into space with a distant, vacant, and deeply troubled expression, muttering completely incomprehensible words in a guttural and primitive language that no one could identify or place in any linguistic family known to humanity. Nero, her faithful and traditionally courageous canine companion, began to categorically refuse to enter any room in the house where the doll was present, even temporarily, preferring to spend long hours of the day completely alone outside the apartment, pacing nervously along the icy Vienna sidewalks or resting in the building's lobby, where other residents occasionally fed him out of pity for his seemingly abandoned condition. When forced to remain inside the apartment during storms or extreme cold, he would strategically position himself near the windows, barking occasionally but determinately at the glass as if desperately trying to alert his human owner to some imminent and mortal danger that only his keen animal senses could detect and comprehend, but which she stubbornly refused to acknowledge or take seriously due to her growing and obsessive fascination with the golden creature she had brought home. The domestic situation reached its most dramatic and terrifying turning point on a stormy Friday night in late October, when Elena suddenly awoke with the physical, visceral, and utterly terrifying sensation that she was no longer alone and safe in her own private room, a space that had always represented her last refuge of peace and security in the world. The autumnal rain pounded violently and relentlessly against the building's historic windows, creating dancing, grotesque shadows that moved across the walls like spectral figures straight from the deepest nightmares of the human subconscious, while deafening, menacing thunderclaps echoed through the sleeping city like ancient voices calling the dead to rise from their eternal tombs. The electric atmosphere of the storm seemed to carry an otherworldly energy that made every hair on Elena's body stand on end simultaneously, as if the very air itself were charged with palpable malevolence and hostile intentions directed specifically at her. As she slowly opened her still sleep-heavy eyes and gradually adjusted her vision to the dense darkness of the room, her heart nearly stopped beating completely for several eternal seconds. The golden Labubu was strategically positioned on her personal bedside table, just a few crucial inches from her vulnerable, unprotected face, with that permanent, eternal smile that now seemed arguably more sinister, menacing, and malevolent than it had ever seemed during all her conscious daytime. Observations. The doll wasn't simply placed casually on the table, but positioned with mathematical precision so that its blue eyes were exactly aligned with hers, creating a direct and disturbing line of sight that seemed to pierce her soul like a spiritual laser. Its blue eyes shone with a light of their own, unearthly and impossible in the pitch-black darkness of the room, pulsing softly like distant stars or embers of a sacred fire burning with fuel that transcended known physical laws, and Elena could solemnly swear she could see tiny movements, almost imperceptible but definitely real, as if the doll were breathing silently and rhythmically, its tiny chest rising and falling with the regularity of a genuine living being. Completely paralyzed by the absolute terror that froze every muscle in her body as if injected with a supernatural anesthetic, Elena remained rigidly still for long minutes that stretched into hours of psychological torture, staring intently at the creature she had willingly brought into her sacred home, while a terrible, inescapable certainty gradually grew in her heart like a malignant tumor of forbidden knowledge. She was no longer safe, secure, or in control of her own home, her own life, or her own soul, which now belonged in some mysterious and irrevocable way to that golden entity that smiled eternally with barely concealed malice and the predatory patience of geological eons. The realization of her complete and defenseless vulnerability was so intense and devastating that she could physically feel her sanity beginning to shatter at the edges like glass under extreme pressure, as the objective reality she had always considered solid and reliable began to dissolve into nightmarish possibilities that her rational mind desperately refused to accept as true. Desperate, terrified, and mentally fragmented beyond any previous experience in her relatively sheltered existence, Elena made the courageous and necessary decision to obsessively investigate the mysterious origin and dark history of her cursed doll, compulsively scouring the internet for days and nights without adequate rest, searching for any scrap of information, conspiracy theory, or anecdotal account that could rationally explain the progressively intense supernatural events that were systematically destroying her sanity, emotional stability, and basic ability to function as a normal human being in contemporary society. It was during this manic and exhaustive research that she discovered an extensive and detailed series of genuinely disturbing accounts from other collectors scattered around the world, all describing eerily similar and equally terrifying experiences after acquiring golden Labubu dolls physically identical to her own, suggesting a global pattern of paranormal phenomena connected specifically to these seemingly innocent creations. The documented stories were consistently shocking and deeply disturbing in their almost impossible similarity. household objects moving on their own during the early hours of the morning following intelligent patterns, invisible but definitely real presences walking through residential hallways, vivid and shared nightmares often involving children lost in otherworldly landscapes, and most alarmingly, a progressive and seemingly irreversible deterioration of the owner's mental health that followed predictable stages like a supernatural degenerative disease. Some more detailed and scientific accounts mentioned that victims invariably began to hear incomprehensible whispers in languages that professional linguists have identified as centuries-old dialects, developed obsessive and ritualistic behaviors specifically related to the doll that gradually consumed their daily lives, and in the most extreme and documented cases, simply disappeared without leaving any physical or digital trace, leaving behind only their empty residences and their intact doll collections, with the golden Labubu always occupying a central and prominent position like a queen presiding over her kingdom of inanimate subjects. Determined to permanently and definitively rid herself of the supernatural curse that had infected her existence like a spiritual virus, Elena desperately tried multiple strategies to return the doll to the centuries-old shop where she worked, explaining in detail to her understanding Austrian supervisor that she no longer felt comfortable or safe keeping the creature in her residence due to the unexplained events that were negatively affecting her mental health and overall quality of life. She meticulously documented all paranormal phenomena, created a detailed diary of supernatural occurrences, and even recorded audio evidence of the ghostly footsteps that echoed through the house in the wee hours. However, the next day, when she arrived at work punctually as she had for months, Elena found the golden Labubu waiting patiently for her on her desk, positioned exactly in the center like a macabre trophy, as if it had never left for even a moment, with that eternal smile that now seemed to openly mock her pathetic and desperate efforts to escape her preordained supernatural fate. Not easily surrendered to the seemingly impossible situation, she then attempted to sell it through multiple e-commerce platforms, carefully and professionally photographing it from different lighting angles, creating detailed and compelling commercial descriptions on various international digital platforms, setting competitive prices, and even offering free shipping anywhere in the world to ensure a quick and definitive sale. But all her attempts at a commercial transaction mysteriously failed in different but equally frustrating ways. Initially interested and enthusiastic buyers canceled their offers at the last possible minute without providing any logical explanation or justification. E-commerce sites crashed specifically when she tried to finalize sales while functioning perfectly for other products. Payment systems rejected transactions for no identifiable technical reason, and on one particularly disturbing occasion, an Italian collector who had enthusiastically confirmed the purchase and had already transferred the full payment simply disappeared from the digital world, with his online account mysteriously deleted and his social media profile evaporating, as if he had never existed, leaving only the transferred money, which was automatically refunded to a non-existent bank account. As a desperate last resort born of a complete lack of rational alternatives, Elena took the extreme step of physically destroying the doll through purifying fire, carefully transporting it to the communal courtyard of her apartment building during a moonless dawn, building a ritual bonfire with dry wood collected from the nearby municipal park, and mentally preparing herself to watch her curse be consumed by the liberating flames. When she finally summoned the courage to throw the golden Labubu directly into the center of the dancing flames that licked the night air with purifying orange tongues, something impossible and physically inexplicable happened. The flames extinguished instantly and completely the exact moment they touched the doll's golden surface, as if a supernatural, protective force had blown the fire away with an invisible wind more powerful than any natural meteorological phenomenon. The doll remained completely intact and unchanged on the cold, dead ashes of the failed bonfire, smiling with that eternally innocent expression that now seemed to convey a clear and terrifying message. She was indestructible, immortal, and permanently linked to Elena's existence through bonds that transcended physical, chemical, or spiritual laws comprehensible by contemporary human science. From that particular moment of utter despair and forced acceptance of supernatural reality, Elena understood with terrifying, crystal-clear clarity that she was irremediably and permanently trapped in a hellish, inescapable cycle from which she would never be able to free herself through conventional, scientific, or even traditional religious means. The golden Labubu doll had become a permanent and inseparable extension of her mortal existence, a sinister and eternal companion that would obsessively follow her until the end of her earthly days and possibly beyond physical death, slowly but steadily feeding on her sanity, life energy, and spiritual essence like a supernatural parasite that grew stronger and more powerful with each day of forced coexistence. Her nights definitively turned into tortured and endless vigils, where she remained awake for agonizing hours observing every suspicious shadow that moved across the walls, listening attentively to every inexplicable noise that broke the sepulchral silence, and mainly feeling the constant weight of the penetrating gaze of the doll that watched her back with those supernatural blue eyes that seemed to see directly through her tormented soul, cataloging every thought, every fear, and every remaining fragment of her deteriorating humanity. During the daytime hours that should have provided relief and normalcy, Elena found herself completely unable to leave the creature alone at home, obsessively carrying it with her everywhere she went, carefully stored in a special bag where she could feel its constant weight against her body as a physical reminder of her supernatural enslavement. The doll seemed to exert an emotional gravitational pull that made physical separation not only uncomfortable, but genuinely painful and impossible to bear for more than a few minutes at a time. Elena had become a willing prisoner of her own passion for collecting beautiful and unique objects, a conscious slave to a curse she had willingly and naively chosen to embrace the fateful moment her eyes had fixed on that seemingly innocent golden doll on a winter morning that now seemed to belong to a completely different and irretrievably lost past life. The following months brought a progressive and seemingly irreversible deterioration of every aspect of her previous existence. Elena lost her job at the toy store after her colleagues and supervisors noticed behavioral changes so extreme that they considered her a potential threat to the safety of customers and the workplace. Her savings quickly depleted due to her inability to hold down a steady job, forcing her to gradually sell off all her personal belongings, except, of course, her doll collection, which remained untouched as a sacred altar dedicated to her new golden deity. Nero, her canine companion who had been her last link to normality and sanity, eventually ran away for good during a nighttime storm, preferring to brave the dangers of Vienna's icy streets rather than remain another day in the presence of the supernatural creature that had completely corrupted her home and her human owner. Socially isolated, financially destroyed, and mentally shattered beyond recovery, Elena lived exclusively to serve and worship her cursed doll, creating elaborate daily rituals of care and worship that consumed every waking hour of her deteriorating existence. She spoke constantly to the golden Labubu in one-sided conversations that gradually became dialogues when she began to hear whispered responses in a childlike voice that seemed to emerge directly from her own throat, but which her conscious mind did not recognize as her own. Her neighbors, initially concerned about the strange noises emanating from her apartment at all hours of the day and night, eventually stopped caring when they realized that their attempts at social intervention or calls to the authorities resulted in official visits where Elena always appeared perfectly normal and rational, while the doll remained strategically hidden during these cursory inspections. And so, my dear friends and devoted followers of this horror channel, ends another true story that serves as a dark and terrifying reminder that the most seemingly innocent, beautiful, and desirable objects are not always truly safe or suitable to inhabit our homes, our lives, or our vulnerable souls. The golden Labubu remains out there, somewhere uncertain in the civilized world, waiting patiently with the eternal patience of geological ages for the next unwary, naive, and vulnerable collector who will inevitably be seduced by its hypnotic beauty and deadly charm that masks an ancient evil older than human civilization itself. Elena was never seen again at the century-old toy store where she worked with dedication and joy, and her third-floor apartment has remained officially empty for many months, with only a bookshelf full of collectible dolls as a silent and eternal witness to the unspeakable horrors that unfolded there during those cursed months of forced coexistence between the human and the supernatural. Some residents of the building report occasionally hearing children's laughter and delicate footsteps echoing through the walls during the quietest of nights, but local authorities officially filed the case as voluntary abandonment of property with no suspicion of criminal activity. If you're a dedicated collector like Elena once was, think very carefully 2, 3, or even 10 times before acquiring your next coveted piece, especially if it seems to call your name through some inexplicable supernatural connection or awaken an obsessive fascination that transcends normal aesthetic appreciation. Some beautiful and desirable things are best left permanently on the shelves of commercial stores, far from our sacred homes, our precious lives, and our immortal souls, which may be more fragile and vulnerable than we could ever imagine in our darkest nightmares. Until next week, my dear viewers, God bless you and keep your doors securely locked during the darkest hours of the night. For you never know what kind of unwanted, supernatural, and eternally hungry companion might be patiently searching for a cozy new home where it can flourish and feed on the life energy of innocent and unsuspecting human hosts.